2016, Johnson toured the country on a bus that promised £350 million a week for the NHS if we left the EU. The case alleges that Johnson made knowingly false statements. Well, we spoke to the prosecutor who intends to bring the case against Boris, Marcus J. Ball. He hopes this action will lead to more honesty in Westminster.
We're prosecuting Mr. Boris Johnson MP for the alleged offence of misconduct in public office. We're accusing Mr. Johnson of lying about how much money the UK spends on EU membership each week and year. We've amassed evidence which is highly persuasive, which suggests that Mr. Johnson knew that the figure of £350 million a week being sent to the EU was actually false. We have to make very clear at this point that only the courts can decide upon innocence or guilt. The key objective is to address lying in politics. Here in the UK and around the world, we have a huge problem when it comes to the honesty of our elected representatives. If we can't trust what they're telling us, we can't trust the democratic process and we can't trust the systems of government. If we can win...
Note. And this is what £361 million looks like in £20 notes. And if you believe the headlines, that's what we're handing over to the EU every week. Or is it? Well, the short answer is no. The UK doesn't hand over this much money to the EU. Let me explain. In 1984, Margaret Thatcher negotiated the rebate, an instant discount taken from the money the UK pays before it's sent. In 2014, the rebate was worth £85 million a week, leaving £276 million being sent to the EU. But that's not the full story, because the money flows in both directions. Every week, the UK Treasury gets £88 million from the EU, and it's divided up into 5 main areas. £50 million of that is spent on farming and fisheries. Most of it goes direct to farmers to keep them in business. Another £11 million goes to rural development to help them improve and maintain life in the countryside. Every week, £20 million is spent on developing less prosperous parts of the country. It's spent on things like transport infrastructure and helping businesses to grow. £5 million goes to social development, tackling things like poverty and unemployment, and the money goes to education and training. And that last piece, £2 million, goes to other EU projects here in the UK. We're talking about things like medical research or low carbon energy funds. So if we subtract what the UK Treasury gets back, we end up with a weekly contribution of £188 million. But the UK private sector also gets money from the EU in 3 main areas: in scientific research, in university funding, and in engineering projects. Add that up and it's £27 million a week. That means when you take away the rebate, the EU money is sent to the Treasury, and the private sector funding, £161 million a week is going to the EU. So, how does that stack up? Well, every week the UK spends £821 million on defence. It spends £1.4 billion on education. On the NHS, £2.6 billion. And on top of that, it spends £3.6 billion on pensions. So the price of EU membership, £161 million a week. Is it worth it?
Well, of course, I regard the whole thing as being a somewhat selfish and destructive act against the European Union, which, for all its faults, remains the greatest peace, prosperity and security project in the world. The arrogance and the kind of British exceptionalism that was demonstrated after what was, after all, a fairly narrow victory on a strange franchise which denied my British mother living in Paris, for instance, the vote, denied my European Union citizen wife the vote, and based on a whole series of false promises and lies. And we now also see possibly even manipulation of the social media via Facebook by these stories now coming out about Cambridge Analytica being involved in colluding with other Leave groups. You do wonder where the strong mandate is for such a hard Brexit. I had always hoped from the beginning that Britain would have stayed as close as possible to the European Union, stayed in the single market, stayed in the customs union. But unfortunately, Mrs May made it very clear from the beginning that Britain had to have a hard Brexit, leave the single market, leave the customs union. And the tone and the rhetoric at the beginning was very hostile, talking about go whistle for your money, Mr Boris Johnson said. Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, said that the European Union citizens living in the United Kingdom were the best negotiating asset, i.e. bargaining chip in the negotiations. This kind of rhetoric set a very hostile tone against the EU 27. The very fact that still the media refer to the Brexit war cabinet as if Britain was at war with its closest partners. And I think there has been a wake-up call. Clearly, Mrs May, after the Mansion House speech and also in Munich, has now tried to reset the tone to a friendlier tone, in particular after the terrible attack in Salisbury with nerve agent presumably done by Russia. She was very grateful for the solidarity shown by countries like France, Germany and most of the EU member states. And so there is a wake-up call now that perhaps the earlier tone was really unhelpful. And now, of course, Britain would like to have this deep and special partnership. But I'm very doubtful it's possible. I think given the fact that we have all these red lines, no supervision by the European Court of Justice, no freedom of movement, no long-term payments into the budget, that we're going to end up with a deal a little bit like Canada, a third country free trade deal, which won't be really good enough. And I think that the British economy will suffer. Britain will be geopolitically isolated in the world. Older people, we discover now, may not even have access to the European health insurance card, which will mean that some of them won't be able to travel. All sorts of things are coming up. Euratom, leaving Euratom, for instance, the fact that medical radioisotopes might not be able to be delivered for cancer treatment as quickly as possible. There'll be huge hold-ups at the borders. It will affect Calais in France as well as Dover. All sorts of problems are being exposed almost daily that weren't really thought about during the campaign. I made all sorts of noises during the campaign, particularly about Ireland. I'm a dual Irish-British citizen. I'm personally lucky I survive as an EU citizen, but that will be denied. The same rights that I will have and my children will have as dual nationals will be denied to millions of young Brits who will no longer have the freedom to move, study, work, live across the whole of the continent like my generation had. It's 44 years of working together to construct a project being untangled. And I think that's very, very sad and very distressing. And so that's why some of the rhetoric, some of the tone, some of the kind of nationalism that it has unleashed, particularly against EU citizens living in Britain, is really unacceptable. That's why I felt ashamed. I don't care what Mr Davis has said. I'm not standing down. I'm going to stay here to complete my mandate to the end of the 5-year term I was elected for. I represent London. London voted a majority to remain. My constituents want Britain to remain in the European Union, so I am fulfilling my mandate within the European Parliament, representing those who voted to remain, and I'll keep on making the case until the very last day as an MEP here in Brussels.
They're constantly on the move in a world that knows no borders. The lines within the European Union Baroque Orchestra are equally blurred. Among them, 13 nationalities this year. Their base has always been Britain, but home is Europe.
All of our orchestra were born after the European Union was invented and so on. They're really used to moving across borders every day. It's one big workplace and they can live wherever they like.
But that's changing, given the UK's decision to go solo. Unimaginable before that to young musicians like Julio Caballero.
Well, it was the main topic for many weeks. And yeah, we were wondering what will happen with the orchestra after this, because we knew that something will have to change.
Inevitable, because for one, the orchestra is funded by the EU, and the looming limits to freedom of movement could spell an unwanted finale. So they're not waiting to find out what happens. As Britain gives official notice to the EU of its intention to leave, they are sounding the final notes of an era and planning to leave too.
The invitation came from Antwerp to think about relocating, and the more we thought about it, the more sensible it seemed to take a strategic view now and make the transition as soon as possible.
Shame on you! Theresa May!
Brexit is going from dreaded possibility to looming eventuality. Its consequences for the estimated 3 million EU nationals living here, especially their free movement, are in some sectors already felt and lamented. Vital sectors, like the National Health Service, where the number of EU nurses registering has reportedly declined by 75% since the vote. An emergency in a system that relies on EU citizens, as this picture of just one surgical team shared countless times demonstrates.
Even small movements in that proportion in the next few years as we train more people domestically would put some of our services at risk. It would mean delays for patients in terms of their treatment. It would mean poorer availability of services in the community for people in their own homes or in residential homes.
London's ambitious construction business has an escalating skills shortage and a looming threat to some 200,000 jobs. In hospitality, some, like this chain, are turning to summer teen internships to try to get ahead of any shortfall.
I would say that 1 in 50 people that apply to our company to work is British.
1 in 50?
1 in 50.
It is a pattern well known in the countless hotels here. At the thriving Georgian House Hotel, Brexit is seen as a broadside that will spare no one. British owned, honed and operated, it is near 88% staffed by EU citizens and has been for the 30 years Serena von der Heydt has run it.
It's completely vital. I can't imagine how we would open our doors and trade if we didn't have our EU employees. And the thought of it is frightening.
So here we have our secret door. Yeah, let's go downstairs.
Gabi Cardos, a Romanian citizen, is proud to work here.
So what do you call this room?
This is a wizard chamber. Here my colleague is finishing to clean. Okay. Oh, I love to work in here.
The price, though, is high. An 8-year-old daughter left behind with her parents. But the hard work pays off.
How much more do you make here than you did in your professional job?
A lot. So now I can afford to live in here, like a decent life, and to send home money.
So she isn't receptive to the future beyond the end of Brexit negotiations 2 years from now. Moving elsewhere means learning a new language, maybe starting at the bottom again.
We are concerned that we need to go home. For me, personally, this is not an option, so I can't go back. We are working here, we pay the taxes, we don't have benefits, so I don't know why they want us to go home.
Uncomfortable questions hang over the uncertainty shared by British and non-British alike. Bojan Cicic happens to be both, a British citizen who first came here as a student from Croatia.
And coming from a country where nationalist fervour took precedent over all else, I know what that means for culture. It's just bad news.
It is one of their last concerts before moving on. Hard to let go.
The world has heard that the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, but nobody in the world knows exactly what that means. Looking at the data from the referendum and from previous votes, however, and we can acquire some likely results. Will the chaos surrounding this vote persist for years to come, or will things eventually settle down and normalize? We're not going to get into the politics behind why the vote happened, we're just going to look at the data and see what could happen next. First things first though, let's look at some of the history that led us up to this point. The United Kingdom first voted on European Union membership in 1975. The vote was approved by 67% of the voters then, and the United Kingdom has been a part of the European Union ever since. Well, until just now, or maybe it is still? This is where the haziness and uncertainty come into this whole situation. When the smoke cleared up on the morning of the 24th of June, the results came in. The United Kingdom has a population estimated to be around 65 million people. Out of that population, roughly 46.5 million people were eligible to vote at the time of the referendum. And out of that group, 33,551,983 people actually voted on the referendum. Therefore, we get a voter turnout across the entire UK of 72.21% of eligible voters. To put that number into a bit of perspective, this is the highest voter turnout of any vote across the entire UK since the general election in 1992. It is a higher turnout than any United States election since the 1900 general election 116 years ago. So, out of all the people who voted, we can see that 16,141,241 people voted to remain in the European Union, while 17,410,742 people voted to leave the European Union. These numbers translate into roughly 48% of people in the UK voting to remain in the European Union, while 52% of people voted to leave the European Union. Let's look at this data on a more regional level next. Excluding London for just a moment, the rest of England voted to leave the European Union with a roughly 55% majority. Wales also voted to leave with a narrow 53% majority. The rest of the United Kingdom voted to remain, and this is where things start to get messy. Starting with London, the only region of England to vote in favour of remaining, we see that nearly 60% of the voters there backed remaining in the European Union. This has led some to call for the secession of London from the UK and the creation of an independent city-state that would resemble Singapore, a city-state that would then rejoin the European Union. A petition to further this goal currently has nearly 180,000 signatures on it, but the odds of this ever happening are likely very small. The odds of another secessionist movement, however, are far many times more likely. To the north, we examine the data from Scotland. Here we saw a rough 67% voter turnout, and out of that population, an obvious majority of 62% voted to remain in the European Union, while 38% voted to leave. This is awkward, to say the least. If we remember, Scotland held a referendum just 2 years earlier in 2014 to decide if Scotland would become an independent country or not. In that election, there was a massive 85% voter turnout across Scotland. Out of that group, 55% of Scots voted to remain a part of the United Kingdom, while 45% voted to leave. Among the largest reasons why people voted to stay inside of the United Kingdom, however, was the fear that should they have left, Scotland would have found itself outside of the European Union and would be forced to reapply for its membership. This large concern is now irrelevant since the United Kingdom is going to leave the European Union, so the Scottish government announced the very next day after the election that government officials would be planning for a, quote, highly likely second referendum on independence from the United Kingdom. Many polls conducted in Scotland in the days since the referendum have found that support for leaving the UK may be ahead by as much as 7% over people wanting to remain now. We don't know if this second referendum will happen as of now, but if it does, it seems pretty likely this time that Scotland would leave the United Kingdom and seek to regain European Union membership, which would cause an awkward border in Britain itself. Would an independent Scotland use euros? Would there be an awkward border between Scotland and the remaining United Kingdom? How could people travel across? What would the UK flag turn into without Scotland? Would the UK even really exist at this point? We don't really know the answers to these questions, but let's cross over to Ireland to examine what the situation here looks like. Around 56% of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union. That's a good majority, but since the rest of the UK voted to leave, they will be leaving as well. But this is awkward too, largely because the Republic of Ireland, which takes up the rest of the island, is a member of the EU and uses euros. While neither the Republic of Ireland nor the United Kingdom are a part of the European Union's Schengen area, they are part of what's called the Common Travel Area between their countries, which basically means that the border between the two parts of Ireland is essentially free and open with very minimal identity checks. You can freely travel across the border without needing a passport or stopping at any checkpoint, but that could change now that Northern Ireland will be leaving the European Union. The border here could become a land border between the UK and the EU and could end up becoming a really serious one. Hypothetically, another possibility is that of Northern Ireland holding a referendum to leave the UK altogether like Scotland and reuniting with the rest of Ireland. It's also unclear whether or not this will ever happen, but seeing as how Northern Ireland voted to remain, it will be interesting to see what will happen here. The final consequences are economic ones. Investors in the worldwide stock markets lost more than $2 trillion just on the 24th of June, which makes that the worst single-day loss in all of history. By the 27th of June, the market losses had risen to $3 trillion, but by the 29th, the markets had mostly stabilized. The value of the pound sterling sank to its lowest value in 31 years, and this data could indicate that the United Kingdom might be heading towards a recession. Perhaps in response to these, there has already been a petition created to hold a second referendum that has been signed by over 4 million people at this point. Diplomatically, the UK government will have to eventually invoke Article 50 of the Treaty of the European Union in order to leave. The article itself says that any state wishing to leave the European Union will have to notify the European Council and will then be given 2 years from that date to negotiate a deal on their departure. Whatever deal is proposed must be approved by a majority of the remaining 27 EU member states and also by the European Parliament. If the two sides can't come to an agreement within the 2-year time frame, then the United Kingdom will basically be kicked out of the EU with no new trade agreements or provisions in place and will be basically left on their own. The time limit can be extended past those 2 years, but that decision needs the unanimous approval of all 27 remaining EU member states to do so. Nobody knows when the UK government will decide to invoke Article 50. They haven't invoked it yet, and no country has ever invoked it before. It could be a while before we see this happen. Overall, though, we don't really know what future the United Kingdom is heading towards. That's why there is so much chaos in the markets and in British political parties, because nobody really knows what is going to happen next. It could very well be the end of the entire United Kingdom as we know it, where we'll see Scotland breaking away and moving back in with Europe, or Northern Ireland leaving and being reunited with the rest of Ireland. Or none of these things will happen and the United Kingdom will stay together, united and separated from Europe. All we do know is that this will take years to figure things out and that history never really does feel like history while we're living through it. Thank you for
Everyone knows who won, but not everyone knows how.
We're about to ask the biggest question in a generation. In or out? And we need a leader.
We need to understand who our voters are.
Appeal to their hearts.
People are feeling angrier, ignored. Is it immigration? You could be honest. Is it race? Which countries don't you like?
New people come in.
We get squeezed out.
We want to return to a time when we knew our place, when things made sense. fictional or not. How to change the course of history. We have to hack the political system.
Hack it?
I'm talking about altering the matrix of politics.
Social media platforms are designed to find like-minded people. Our software will locate and target people that no campaign has ever targeted before. People who don't and have never voted. 3 million extra votes that the other side have no idea exist.
This is an insurgence against the establishment. We're going to build something that will restack the odds in our favor.
What are your expectations, realistically?
To create the biggest political upset since the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Very large.
Yeah. Let's take back control! Let's take back control! Now the fight for Britain begins.
You are feeding a toxic culture of fear and hate. You can't close the box once it's been opened. What's your edge? What have you found?
There is a new politics in town. One that you cannot control.
Can you see what's wrong with this scene? The trick is called forced perspective. It was used to shrink the hobbits in The Lord of the Rings. Deceptive framing has also created false assumptions about the EU, some very dark and some comical. This is the story of how a mythical EU dragon was conjured up and the striking truth behind it all. Headlines like these have been a reliable way for British newspapers to win attention. In 2015, the UN Human Rights Chief urged the UK to tackle tabloid hate speech after migrants were called cockroaches. The article in The Sun began, "Show me pictures of coffins, show me bodies floating in water, play violins, and show me skinny people looking sad. I still don't care."
You referred to a plague of feral humans. I mean, are they all feral? I mean, is it actually a plague?
It's because you look at them and think, you are nothing like me. You don't understand how our culture works. These individuals from some of these cultures they come from are feral humans.
The UN described a nasty underbelly of racism and noted that Nazi media also referred to people as cockroaches and rats. Brexiteers sailed in on fears built up over decades. This campaign poster captures the deception. The migrants aren't heading to Britain and have no way to reach it. The lone white face has been covered by the campaign slogan. When challenged, Nigel Farage felt no pressure to apologise.
Your poster has been taken by many people as deeply offensive, upsetting, racist, anti-Muslim. Would you like to apologise to them tonight?
Well, you know, I issued a very similar poster to that 2 months before with very little debate. The problem with the poster wasn't the image. After all, it appeared on all of our front page newspapers.
A leaflet played on the same fears with more subtle deception. It claims these countries are set to join the EU. In reality, they have applied, but Turkey applied over 30 years ago and couldn't be further from joining. Syria and Iraq have not applied. They are shown for the fear factor. A second leaflet is less subtle. Turkey and Iraq are almost the same colour. The arrow, part of the visual language of invasion, includes all the colours of the region. Let's move the camera for a clearer view. This is what the NHS spends by age group. Add education and pensions, and we have half of all government spending. These are the demographics of immigrants. They are exactly what Britain needs to support its ageing population. There is overwhelming consensus among economists that immigration is good for Britain's economy. Studies show they boost public finances because they pay more in indirect taxes and make much less use of benefits and public services.
What do they know? What do they know of the impact of immigration on school places and hospital waiting lists?
In fact, immigrants pay for more places than they use. European migrants made a positive net contribution of £20 billion to UK public finances between 2000 and 2011. That's enough to pay for an extra 80 million GP visits per year. Immigrants also reduce waiting lists by easing the NHS's recruitment crisis. This year, the NHS has 3,000 fewer EEA nurses, and 4,000 doctors are considering leaving the UK. Here's the second graph. It shows that most Leave voters live in areas with very few immigrants. 9 of the 10 districts with the highest Leave vote had low immigration. Lambeth in London, which recorded the highest Remain vote of 78%, saw a net annual influx of 4,598 immigrants, while Castle Point in Essex saw only 81 new immigrants. But 72% of people there voted Leave. At first, this might seem surprising, but it's a well-established trend that when we meet immigrants, we lose our fear of them. The illusion is broken. The UK media is the least trusted in Europe by some margin. Perhaps even more readers need to recognise the deception before things improve. The Leave campaign also drove fear of losing democratic control.
We cannot hope to govern an independent nation. We cannot hope to have an independent democracy in this country as long as we are members of the EU.
Since 1999, the UK has voted in favour of EU laws 95% of the time and against only 2%. In search of an example of losing control to the EU, Boris suggested that the EU banned odd-shaped bananas, a myth debunked over 20 years ago.
You cannot sell bananas with abnormal curvature of the fingers.
Other comical myths hardly need debunking. In his resignation letter, Boris pointed to a more serious example. He said, "If a country cannot pass a law to save the lives of female cyclists when that proposal is supported at every level of UK government, then I don't see how that country can truly be called independent." The laws he refers to were in fact put forward by the EU and passed despite some resistance among the UK government. Other EU achievements include taking sewage off bathing beaches, cheaper phone calls, fighting tax evasion by global companies, banning spam emails, and major breakthroughs in science and medicine through collaborative projects. But for Boris, the EU was like an alien force taking over Britain.
Let's fight against the great complacent, glutinous armies of the establishment. We can win. We can win on June the 23rd. Campaign between now and June the 23rd. Take back control of our country. Vote Leave, and let's make sure that June the 24th is Independence Day.
The framing of Boris and his colleague Jacob Rees-Mogg as fighting the establishment was also very forced. Jacob's father was the editor of The Times. In his own words, he was effectively born into the establishment. He is for fox hunting, against abortion under any circumstances, and personally delivered a Daily Express petition against foreign aid. But the message resonated with people who had suffered years of income stagnation while the rich had grown richer. The Leave campaign blamed this on immigration, but studies show immigration does not deflate wages, and the real causes are well established. The 2008 financial crisis and government policies criticised by the UN as failing to promote social mobility. People without degrees, perhaps feeling trapped at the wrong end of income inequality, were far more likely to vote Leave. Central London is the EU's richest region, and yet 30% of UK children live in poverty. 100,000 more have fallen below the poverty line in 12 months. Boris and co seem unlikely candidates to deviate from this path. Projecting a fight against the establishment allowed the Leave campaign to brush research, data and expert advice under the carpet.
What economics body is there that they should believe?
All the ones that are part of the sort of institutional infrastructure of big government, be suspicious of.
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts with organisations from acronyms.
The people of this country have had enough of experts.
From organisations with.
In a poll of top economists, 80% agreed that people in the UK would be poorer as a result of Brexit. Only 2% disagreed. Here's why there's such a consensus.
Putting up trade barriers is bad for your economy. The withdrawal from the EU is a form of putting up trade barriers. Full stop. You are ruining your competitiveness specifically with your largest trading partner. It is a fact of life. It's one of the few things in economics we can talk about as a fact of life. The gravity applies.
The UK trades more with Ireland than with China. Yet Jacob Rees-Mogg says a no-deal Brexit would boost the economy by £1.1 trillion. Trump has, of course, employed a similar trick, branding the whole mainstream media as fake and projecting his own alternative facts. Perhaps the Leave campaign's greatest trick, after dishonestly sowing and stoking so much groundless fear themselves, was to steal from that cheap Trump playbook and accuse Remainers of being guilty of their crimes. Just as Trump, the master creator of false facts, shouts fake news at whatever goes against his agenda, so the Brexiteers, the arch-instigators of electoral fear themselves, routinely labelled all the warnings from experts Project Fear. Expert warnings which have come starkly true throughout this shambles of a negotiation period.
Project Fear.
Project Fear.
Project Fear.
The truth is beginning to outshine the mythical dragon of the EU. Polls show that most people would now rather remain in Europe, and there is increasing support for a vote on the final deal, something Jacob Rees-Mogg once supported.
And you could have two referendums, and as it happens, it may be more sense to have the second referendum after the renegotiation is completed.
Should the will of the people change when they have clearly put their deal before them, would he respect that will of the people?
If in 30 years' time the UK wants to rejoin, that would be a matter for the electorate then. But this result must be respected and it must be implemented.
Perhaps in a final vote, facts would start to overcome fears. Wouldn't that be a win for informed democracy?
Give us a wave, Boris. Yeah. To British people.
Okay.
Keep going till June the 23rd, I know.
The Brexit referendum campaign. Brash. High octane. Occasionally bizarre.
Nigel, you're a fraud.
It divided a nation.
We're full! We're full! We are full!
Then changed it. And it was euphoria or despair.
I love this country, and I feel honoured to have served it.
In the wake of this enduring political earthquake.
The sun has risen on an independent, united kingdom.
Now, amidst mounting talk of a second referendum, we delve back into the first, into the world of Arron Banks, the Leave campaigner's biggest donor, glimpsing the methods of the man with the money and exposing his group's tactics after the murder of the Labour MP Joe Cox in the final week of the referendum.
I haven't got any words to describe how I feel about that. No. That is horrible. That is so horrible.
We've been shown email correspondence and invoices never previously made public, which take you inside Arron Banks' campaign during the referendum. Documents rich in tactics and spending trails. It's clear from them how wide his influence extended across other Leave campaigns. But did rules to ensure a fair referendum get broken in the process?
It's referendum result day, and alongside Nigel Farage is his old ally and self-appointed guard dog, Arron Banks. They weren't the official Leave campaign.
Do you think we can do it? I think we can do it.
Losing that bitterly fought contest to vote Leave, and with it, a £7 million spending limit. Instead, Arron Banks and his group Leave.eu had a £700,000 limit, 99% of which they declared they'd spent. The Electoral Commission, whom Banks derides as Muppets, has already fined his group for breaching their spending limit. But was there more? A way to get around the rules by using other campaigners. In one email, we've seen a colleague suggest to Mr. Banks potentially helping a small number of groups to raise their funding. Using them, he goes on, could take our activities from a £700,000 cap to a £5 million cap. And if he did use any such groups, was one of them Labour Leave? But first, UKIP, and Nigel Farage in May 2016 unveils his new battle bus.
No, it's not.
Soon to tour the UK to the theme tune of The Great Escape. It became one of the defining images of the referendum. It's all UKIP colours and slogans. But the hidden hand of Arron Banks and Leave.eu was never far away, it seems. Right down to arranging the bus hire and designing its look.
Now, of course, we know Arron Banks and his Leave.eu group were close to Nigel Farage and UKIP. Both men are great friends, and here they were, after all, on the same side, campaigning for Brexit. Nothing wrong with that. However, if two campaign groups spend money as part of a coordinated plan or arrangement, then rules apply. Each has to tell the Electoral Commission and declare the total sum of those joint costs, because if they don't...
The concern is there's a hidden funder of the common plan expense activity that is at or near its expense limit, but has lots of cash to spend. If it can do that by funding the activity of the other organisation that makes the declaration and is a position to declare that money because it's not at its limit, it's found a way to evade the limits on its own expenditure.
And cheat the system.
And cheat the system.
In emails we've seen planning UKIP's bus tour, it's a Leave.eu staff member who emails the bus company in UKIP, attaching the image we'd like featured, and asking for the words, "Make June the 23rd our Independence Day," added to the back. Arron Banks himself at one point instructs, the UKIP logo needs to be put at the back in small letters. Emails suggest Banks personally signed off over £50,000 for UKIP's bus tour, that Leave.eu sent staff to work on it, authorised payments for additional drivers, and yet no joint spending was declared. Only UKIP reported the costs.
Are you surprised by that?
Yes, I'm very surprised by that. On the evidence that I've seen, it is at least, on the face of it, at least common plan expenses that should have been declared by both participants in the arrangement. It would, of course, be much more serious if it was, in fact, all Leave EU's expenditure and didn't appear anywhere in their return.
But Arron Banks, of course, wasn't just funding campaigners on the right. He very publicly courted the left too, convinced that Labour voters were key to winning the referendum. And among those who eagerly embraced his patronage were campaigners from the group called Labour Leave. In the referendum's memorable, at times farcical, Battle of the Thames,
Hi guys!
with Nigel Farage was Arron Banks and Kate Hoey, one of several Eurosceptic Labour MPs who made up Labour Leave.
I have never met anyone who is more determined to get our country out of the European Union as Arron.
A pro-Brexit group not affiliated to the Labour Party, but chaired at the time by Labour donor John Mills, who claimed they'd mobilised over 140,000 supporters.
The Remain campaign is financed by big business to the tune of millions.
But Labour Leave doesn't have anything like the level of financial support. Today I'm asking you for your support.
They appeared alongside other Leave groups, their website proclaiming their campaign to be independent, funded and staffed by Labour, trades unions and Socialist Society members. Yet evidence we've seen suggests key Labour Leave figures were paid by Arron Banks' organisation, including General Secretary Brendan Chilton, Director of Strategy Nigel Griffiths, and Head of Media Ollie Hewitson. Mr Hewitson and Mr Griffiths told us they'd expected the payments to be properly declared. Brendan Chilton declined to comment. Their Westminster office was paid for also by an Arron Banks company, which we've discovered Labour Leave didn't declare properly. And this, we can reveal, is now the subject of an investigation by the Electoral Commission. We have Labour Leave team members apparently being paid by Arron Banks, your office and facilities provided by him. Why was none of this ever properly declared?
Well, it was declared. The office was declared.
But it wasn't declared properly, was it?
No,
the Electoral Commission?
It was declared subsequently. There was a mistake made on the bureaucratic over timing, but it was certainly declared to the Electoral Commission.
What about the team payments? Those weren't declared properly, were they?
The only responsibility I took was for expenditure that was authorised by Labour Leave, that was in our budget, that was where we had the money in the bank, and where we were sure that we were not exceeding the expenditure limit.
So you're saying you couldn't have declared it because you didn't know it was happening?
That's correct.
Again, Labour Leave and Leave.eu never declared any working together costs, which is odd given the apparent coordination witnessed in the emails. In one exchange, John Mills from Labour Leave suggests costs for print invoices totalling nearly £9,000 are split between Labour Leave and Leave.eu. Arron Banks replies, that's fine.
What was agreed, he'd pay his costs and we'd pay our costs. Is that joint working? It doesn't sound like joint working to me.
Numerous emails show members of Labour Leave asking Leave.eu for funding, social media help, for travel and hotel expenses to be approved, campaign materials too. Do you think the Electoral Commission and your 140,000 Labour supporters, as you claim, had an accurate picture of the true relationship between Arron Banks and Labour Leave?
I think they thought that Labour Leave was an entirely separate organisation.
I'm just asking you, do you think they got an accurate picture?
Yes, I think they did.
The Electoral Commission?
I think they did. And I think the idea that he was sort of in the sort of puppet master running us all was completely fabrication, not true.
So you don't accept that he had any influence, exerted any influence on your organisation?
Well, of course he must have had some influence, but a tiny, tiny amount. What we were our own people, we ran our own ship, we had our own money, he did not provide any cash for us at all. He may have employed some of the people that we did and paid them, but they were separate from anything that was authorised expenditure by Labour Leave.
A term which he claims became generic for Labour Brexiteers. And then came the murder of Joe Cox. In the aftermath of the Labour MP's death, just a week before the vote,
both sides in the bitter referendum campaign have suspended their activities tonight.
Emails the following morning show Leave.eu figures debating how Labour Leave should respond. A draft press release condemns the media as deplorable for making political mileage for Remain from Joe Cox's death. Blackmailing Brexiteers to tone down their campaign is a new low, it says. One Leave.eu figure suggests altering the wording. I think it also needs more about being a time for showing respect, he writes, and drawing unsubstantiated inferences about motive or causes at such a time is disrespectful to Joe Cox's memory. But Leave.eu's Andy Wigmore replies, no, don't need to say this. Her husband has already made it political. The tone is about right. Aaron Banks is shown the draft release in Labour Leave's name. Much better for them to do it, he says. Labour Leave would later condemn the statement, claiming it had been issued falsely in their name.
I haven't got any words to describe how I feel about that. It's... no. That Brendan would make political capital about his wife being murdered on the street immediately after her death. Why would anybody suggest that?
You're shocked to hear about this?
Yeah.
Aaron Banks, whose group claimed to have paused campaigning, but who in private, the morning after Joe Cox's death, the emails show, is urging his team to bolster spending on what appears to be an existing social media campaign video. Keep pumping the McKenna video, he says, and up the spend. Leave.eu's CEO writes, with no active campaigning, it could get a lot of take-up today. Exactly, Banks replies, press it harder. Adding later, boost it more. The ban is on news stuff and activity, not the sponsored page.
At the centre of this was a colleague of mine with a young family who was murdered doing her job. Why would you use that to benefit your campaign? You know, there've got to be limits. And it seems to me that the way in which these people operate, there are no limits.
Not my style. Not my style.
Was Aaron Banks not your style?
Well, I think some things that Aaron Banks did weren't my style. No, that's absolutely correct.
And yet you seemed quite collegiate with him during the campaign.
We were thrown together. I mean, we were on the same side in the campaign. I mean, this is true of all the other organisations that are involved in the campaigning. This is the way politics works.
The leaked emails raise other serious questions about possible undeclared spending. When UKIP's Nigel Farage attended this rally in Gateshead, he got here, we can reveal, by private jet, it seems, and paid for by the Banks organisation. Invoices we've seen suggest they paid almost £12,500 for the flight, signed off by Aaron Banks, the campaigner who framed Brexit as a war on the elite. But nowhere can we find this cost declared to the Electoral Commission. And if it wasn't declared?
And if it wasn't declared, then there is a breach of the Act and possibly a criminal offence as well.
On both sides of the referendum campaign there were breaches. But it's Aaron Banks who's still being investigated over the source of the millions he ploughed into the referendum. As for Leave.eu, the pro-Brexit movement he claims made history, their guerrilla war, as Mr. Banks previously described it, seemingly continues, now urging supporters to try to get pro-Remain Tory MPs deselected. Underestimating me, he once wrote, is a big mistake.
Andy Davis is with us now. Andy, have we heard anything from Mr. Banks himself?
Not Mr. Banks, but from his associate Andy Wigmore, who tweeted within the last hour that our use of these emails was selective and misleading, but no substantive response. We wrote to Mr. Banks on Wednesday, setting out our findings and inviting him to respond in time for yesterday's programme. He said he needed 5 days or so to assess the volume of material in our letter. We extended the deadline to today. He said he needed more time, so we haven't heard from him. UKIP have issued a statement saying that that private jet trip by Nigel Farage wasn't a UKIP expense, wasn't organised by UKIP, wasn't paid for by them. We've had a statement also from Joe Cox's husband, Brendan Cox, this evening. He said, "It's sad and disappointing that at a moment when the country was united in profound shock, a handful of people were seeking to take political advantage of her killing. This isn't a reflection on Brexit or Brexiteers, it's a reflection solely on the people involved."
What next?
There is an ongoing investigation involving Mr. Banks, who, of course, I should say, has always denied any wrongdoing. But this is a National Crime Agency investigation, which we understand is looking into whether he is the true source of the donations and loans made during that campaign. So that's where the focus is at the moment, and we await any developments in that case.
Andy Davies. Well, now, we showed his film to Labour MPs Alison McGovern and Jess Phillips, who were both friends of the murdered MP Joe Cox. This was the first time either of them had been aware of Arron Banks's role in campaigning at the time of their friend's death. After watching our report, I began by asking them what they thought of the emails that were sent on the day after Joe died.
Watching that just makes me feel sick. The day Joe was killed, I mean, that was the worst day of it's one of the worst days of my life, definitely the worst day ever in my political life. And to think that that was a discussion that was going on makes me deeply upset.
In that moment after Joe's murder, there was Banks saying, "We've got to press harder."
God, if I'd had any idea, I would have really gone to town, because we were trying to focus on this woman, a brilliant woman who we had lost in the worst way. And we were trying to focus on what was good about her life. And there is somebody saying, what can I gain from this?
I mean, it tells you everything you need to know about Arron Banks. He's thinking about how he can play the angles. Push it harder after a national crisis like that.
I'm just wondering whether you feel the Electoral Commission have really been anywhere near any of this.
Oh my goodness, the Electoral Commission have to, I think, do so much more to demonstrate that they have control of this situation. I mean, in some ways, I have sympathy if the problem is they don't have enough teeth, maybe, but clearly there's a whole issue here that we're only beginning to understand. This won't just stop here. This could affect every democratic event in the future. And we have got to get control of what's going on here.
The painful conceit to me is the idea that these campaigns were being fought by passionate working class people against an elite, when actually what you have is a multi-millionaire with absolutely no heart, no feeling. Doesn't matter who he takes down. There is nothing about my community that Arron Banks represents.
If Arron Banks was breaching the rules and pulling the strings, what should happen?
The Electoral Commission have got to throw the book at him and be able to do so. I think everybody's concerned that they simply don't have enough power, and the Prime Minister's got to make sure that this can be fully investigated and the most significant penalties be levied.
So there's a sort of local Labour stalwart denying that there was any influence on that campaign from Mr. Banks. What do you think?
I think John Mills it's clear that there was involvement, and I think, I really wish in British politics people could admit when they'd done something wrong. It's very clear from the evidence that Arron Banks was involved in a Labour Party campaign, and frankly, I think the Labour Party should take that incredibly seriously and sever their ties with those people.
Given that there was only a 4% difference between Leave and Remain, is it a safe result?
People watching will be able to say, oh, well, they voted Remain, they're just bitter. I actually am much more interested in the facts than what I can lay over them for my own political opinion. I want to know the facts because I want to know what happened over those weeks and months. And if something happened that wasn't fair, we deserve to know about that. And if something happened where another state actor was involved in our democracy, That is so deeply serious that no, you know, a select committee with the greatest will in the world, we need a Mueller-style inquiry into this. And Theresa May needs to make clear that she is also interested in the facts. This isn't about he said, she said. This isn't about Remain versus Leave. This is about the fundamental principle of our democracy.